The Obsidian Hotel. Part 1. The Echoes of Main Street. The taxi, reeking faintly of stale air freshener and forgotten hopes, pulled up to the curb with a hiss of brakes. Detective Ethan Blackwood, officially on a sabbatical he hadn't asked for, stared up at the behemoth that now stood before him. The Stay on Main Hotel. Locals, however, still knew it by its infamous former name, the Cecil. Or, as the dark whispers across Los Angeles called it, the Obsidian. It was a monument to faded glory and lurking dread. 21 stories of tarnished grandeur, its Art Deco facade crumbling gracefully, like a grand dame slowly succumbing to age and regret. The sign, a modern, minimalist stay on Main, did little to erase the ghostly imprints of its past. Ethan could feel it already, a low hum beneath his skin, a subtle pressure against his temples. He'd read the news, of course. Everyone in LAPD had. But reading about it and standing before it were two vastly different experiences. He paid the driver, hoisted his worn leather duffel bag onto his shoulder, and stepped out onto the cacophony of Main Street. The late afternoon sun, a weak, bruised orange, barely penetrated the canyon of towering buildings. The air was thick with exhaust fumes, the distant wail of sirens, and a pervasive scent Ethan couldn't quite place. Something metallic, something old, something unsettling. Ethan had come to the Obsidian for a very specific reason, one that involved a cold case file that had haunted his dreams for years. A victim whose face he couldn't forget, a crime scene that defied logic. Officially, he was here to rest and recover from a particularly brutal case that had left him with a gnawing emptiness and a persistent tremor in his left hand. Unofficially, he was chasing a ghost, a thread that inexplicably led him to this, the most infamous hotel in Los Angeles. He pushed open the heavy glass doors, their brass handles grimy despite recent cleaning efforts. The lobby was vast, cavernous, and strangely lifeless. The opulent chandeliers, though freshly polished, cast a dim, almost sepulchral light. The original marble floor, chipped and worn, was crisscrossed with cheap industrial carpeting. The once grand reception desk, a dark, polished wood, now felt less like a welcome and more like a barrier. A young woman with tired eyes and a forced smile looked up from her computer. Her name tag read, Maria, front desk. "Welcome to Stay on Main," she recited, her voice flat. "Checking in." "Ethan Blackwood," he replied, placing his ID on the counter. "I have a reservation. Room 1109. Maria's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Ethan, a detective by nature, didn't miss it. Room 1109. He knew its history. It was one of the rooms whispered about, a room with activity. "Right this way, Detective Blackwood," she said, her voice a little too bright now. "Here's your key card. Elevators are just past the lounge. 11th floor." She avoided his gaze, handing him a thin, almost insubstantial key card. It felt cold against his palm, colder than it should. As he walked past the dimly lit lounge, a chill slithered down his spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The old velvet armchairs looked like they'd swallowed secrets for decades. The air grew heavier, denser, as he approached the elevators. There were 3 of them, their brass doors scratched and dented, reflecting his distorted image like a funhouse mirror. He pressed the up arrow. A faint, almost imperceptible hum emanated from the shafts, a sound that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. He stepped into the first elevator that arrived, its interior a claustrophobic box of peeling wallpaper and flickering fluorescent lights. The floor indicator above the door was a relic, a manual dial with a single, jerky arrow. He slid his key card into the slot, then pressed 11. The doors hissed shut. The elevator groaned, lurched, and began its slow, grinding ascent. Ethan watched the numbers climb. 2, 3, 4. With each floor, the pressure in his head intensified. He could hear it now, a subtle, almost melodic murmur, rising from the depths of the building, a sound that wasn't quite a voice, but more like a choir of distant, overlapping whispers. It was the hotel, he realized, the Obsidian, and it was singing. As the elevator passed the 9th floor, the lights in the car flickered wildly, threatening to plunge him into darkness. The murmur grew louder, more distinct, twisting into something resembling a name. "Elisa." The elevator jolted violently, swaying in its shaft. Ethan grabbed the handrail, his knuckles white. The floor indicator jammed between 10 and 11, oscillating erratically. The whispered name echoed, no longer distant, but right beside his ear. And then, just as suddenly, the elevator stopped. Not with a smooth glide, but with a harsh, metallic clang. The doors remained stubbornly shut. Ethan was trapped between floors, in the dark, with the unseen voices of the Obsidian for company. His sabbatical was already proving to be anything but restful. The metallic clang of the elevator stopping was followed by an absolute, profound silence that felt louder than the preceding noise. The lights, though still flickering, refused to die completely. Ethan Blackwood released the handrail, forcing himself to breathe deeply. Years of detective work had trained him to react to danger, not to ghosts. But the immediate environment of the Obsidian Hotel felt like an active crime scene where the criminal was invisible. "Maintenance," Ethan called out, his voice sounding hollow and tinny in the confined space. "I'm stuck between 10 and 11. Room 1109. Only the faint, rhythmic whirring of the cooling fans responded. He tried the emergency call button. It produced a weak, buzzing static, then nothing. He noticed the keycard slot. He'd inserted the card, but had he left it in? No. He'd pulled it out, standard procedure. He checked the floor buttons again. All the numbers were dark, except for the 11 button, which glowed with a sickly, intermittent orange light. He watched the floor indicator, still jammed between the numbers. His detective instincts kicked in, suppressing the cold dread. He was observing an anomaly. He pulled out his phone. No service, which wasn't unusual for old downtown buildings, but frustrating nonetheless. He was isolated. As he waited for the hotel to inevitably notice his absence, his gaze fell upon the reflection in the polished brass elevator doors. The flickering light created a strange, staccato effect, turning his own movements into a jerky, unnerving silent film. Suddenly, the reflection shifted. It wasn't his own reflection that moved, but something superimposed, a fleeting image in the periphery of the brass. A tall, gaunt figure in a dark, brimmed hat stood directly behind him. The figure was utterly silent, utterly motionless. Ethan spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs, his hand instinctively dropping to the small of his back, where his service pistol usually rested. Except he was on sabbatical, and the gun was locked in his duffel bag. There was nothing there, just the peeling wallpaper and the relentless, dim glow of the lights. He turned back to the reflection, his breath shallow. The figure was gone, but the residue of the image, the sudden, intense feeling of being watched by something ancient and predatory, remained. He was immediately reminded of the hotel's most disturbing guests, Richard Ramirez, the night stalker, who had stayed on the 14th floor in the mid-'80s, leaving a trail of death in the neighborhood before returning to clean the blood from his clothes. And Jack Unterweger, the Austrian serial killer, who chose the Cecil during his murderous trip across America. This elevator, these walls, they had witnessed the shadows of pure evil. Just as the silence threatened to overwhelm him, a faint, rhythmic thumping began to drift down the elevator shaft. It was a slow, deliberate sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor above. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming from the 11th floor. He pressed the 11 button again, harder this time. Instead of ascending, the elevator gave another violent lurch, this time dropping a few feet with a groan of straining cables. The lights went out entirely. Total, suffocating darkness. The rhythmic thumping stopped immediately. In the ensuing blackness, the whispers returned, no longer melodic, but frantic, desperate. They were all around him, seeming to press against the walls of the small car. Don't look at the water. The roof. He's watching. The voice, the one that had whispered Elisa, returned, clear and heartbreaking. He promised me peace, but I found the water. The darkness, thick with sound, was suddenly shattered. The lights snapped back on with a blinding flash, accompanied by a deafening dong of the elevator bell. The car was motionless, suspended between floors 10 and 11. Ethan stared, bewildered. The whispers vanished instantly, replaced by the mechanical drone of the fans. He was alone. Then, with a gentle thump that felt utterly unnatural after the preceding violence, the elevator cables caught hold. The car smoothly began to ascend again. The floor indicator arrow glided perfectly from 10 to 11. The doors slid open onto the 11th floor hallway. The air here was noticeably colder, damp, and heavy with the scent of ozone and mildew. The hallway was long, illuminated by a single, weak bulb at the far end. Room 1109 was directly to his left. The hallway was silent. Too silent. But on the dirty linoleum floor, directly outside the elevator doors, Ethan saw a trail of residue. It was a narrow, fading track of water, dragging away from the elevator and down the hallway towards the far end. The water was slowly drying, leaving a dark, mottled stain on the floor. It looked exactly like the track of something heavy and wet that had just been dragged, frame by frame, in a terrifying, unseen silent film. Ethan Blackwood stepped onto the 11th floor, his senses on high alert. The atmosphere was a palpable entity, cold, stagnant, and faintly metallic. He cast a quick, professional glance down the long, dimly lit corridor. The wet drag marks he'd seen outside the elevator continued for about 20 feet before fading completely into the patchy linoleum. The trail wasn't thick, but it was definite, a sign of recent, heavy movement. He ignored the instinct to pursue the trail immediately. His priority was his room, 1109, and the duffel bag containing his locked service pistol and his case files. The terror he'd felt in the elevator had sharpened his focus. This wasn't just a spooky old building. It was actively hostile. He inserted his key card into the lock of 1109. The mechanism clicked open with a weak, sickly sound. He pushed the door open, bracing himself. The room was small, sparse, and permeated by a profound, unmistakable dampness. It wasn't the smell of a leak. It was the smell of soaked decay, like clothing left wet in a cramped closet for months. The single window overlooked a narrow, gloomy air shaft, offering no light or fresh air. The wallpaper was peeling in long, curling strips, and the carpet was heavily stained in patterns Ethan didn't want to analyze. The first thing he did was confirm his security. He placed his duffel bag in the closet, carefully locking the small, reinforced box inside containing his weapon and LAPD credentials. He wasn't on duty, but the Obsidian was making him feel dangerously exposed. He quickly scanned the room for anything obvious. No signs of forced entry, no recent damage, but a persistent, low-level vibration came from the aging radiator beneath the window. He moved to the small, cheap desk. Under the flimsy desk lamp, he pulled out his research, the infamous, unsolved case file that had consumed his sabbatical. It was the case of Elisa Lam. The elevator footage was the most compelling and terrifying piece of evidence. Lam, a young Canadian tourist, had been found dead in the hotel's rooftop water tank in 2013, weeks after vanishing. The video showed her acting erratically in the elevator, pressing all the buttons, stepping out, and gesturing wildly, then hiding as if from an invisible pursuer. Ethan watched the grainy footage on his tablet again. Lam's movements were frantic, but they were also directed. She wasn't just hallucinating, she was interacting with something. And then he remembered the whisper in the elevator shaft just minutes ago. Elisa. He promised me peace. But I found the water. The voices were real. The hotel was holding onto the echoes of its victims. He stood up, his gaze sweeping the room again. Why this room? Why 1109? He pulled back the thin curtains covering the airshaft window. The dampness was strongest here. He noticed something tucked into the crack where the window met the frame. It was a single, long strand of dark hair, stuck firmly to the old, cracked putty. He carefully extracted it with tweezers from his kit and sealed it in a tiny evidence bag. Likely meaningless, but in the Obsidian, every detail felt significant. Then, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. There was a section of plaster directly above the bed that was darker than the rest, almost black. He stood on the mattress to examine it closely. The stain was roughly circular, about the size of a dinner plate, and it wasn't mildew. It was a water stain, deep and old, but its edges were unervingly distinct. It looked exactly like the imprint left by something incredibly wet resting there for a very long time, seeping through the plaster. He thought of the trail of wet drag marks outside the elevator. He thought of the desperate voice of Elisa whispering about finding the water. And he thought of the ultimate resting place of the real Elisa Lam, the rooftop water tank. Ethan quickly pulled out the hotel floor plans he'd acquired from an old contact. He traced the position of room 1109. His bed was directly below the room above it, room 1209. He quickly checked the plan above that. Room 1309. Then room 1409. He noticed a chilling pattern in the hotel's history. The 14th floor was where serial killer Richard Ramirez stayed. The 9th floor was the site of multiple suicides. But he was on the 11th floor, the floor that housed the whispers of the past. He felt the low thrum of the building intensify. The floorboards beneath his feet vibrated almost imperceptibly. He knelt down and pulled back the corner of the stained, industrial carpet. The original hardwood beneath was blackened and scarred, not just with age, but with something corrosive. The black stains formed faint, almost unrecognizable shapes, like outlines of objects, maybe even limbs. He traced the largest shape with his finger. It was roughly the shape of a human torso. Ethan backed away, his throat tight. This room wasn't just damp. It was haunted by something that had been thoroughly, chemically dissolved into the floorboards. The stain on the ceiling, the hair on the window, the whispered names, they were all converging, pointing him toward the hotel's true, dark heart. He grabbed his keys and the small baggie with the hair. He needed to find Maria at the front desk. He needed to know the history of room 1109. He needed to know who had stayed here and why the room felt like it was drowning. Absolutely. Ethan leaves the unnerving confines of 1109 and heads back to the lobby, determined to find answers about the room's dark past. The descent in the elevator was smooth, almost aggressively so, after the violence of the ascent. It was as if the hotel was mocking his fear, assuring him that the previous experience had been nothing but a minor, mechanical hiccup. Ethan, however, knew better. The echoes of Elisa and the memory of the wet drag marks outside 1109 were too vivid to be dismissed as nerves. He found Maria still behind the reception desk, tapping slowly at her keyboard. She looked up, her tired eyes widening slightly when she saw him. "Detective Blackwood," she said, her smile brittle. "Did you find everything satisfactory on the 11th floor?" Ethan leaned on the counter, speaking low to avoid attracting attention from the few transient guests lurking near the entrance. "The elevator stalled, Maria. And my room, 1109, is damp. Seriously damp. There's a distinct smell of mildew and decay, and a massive water stain on the ceiling." Maria's forced professionalism nearly cracked. She fiddled with a stack of room receipts. "I'm so sorry, sir. We've been trying to deal with old plumbing issues. We can move you if you like, maybe to the 9th floor." "No." Ethan cut her off. "I want to stay in 1109. But I need to know something about that room. I'm not talking about plumbing. I'm talking about history. What happened in 1109? What left those chemical burns on the floorboards?" Maria lowered her voice further, her eyes darting nervously toward the ceiling. "Sir, I just started 6 months ago. Before it was Stay on Main, this place, it was called the Cecil. A lot of things happened. No one talks about the room specifically. We're told not to." She finally met his gaze, her expression pleading. "Please, sir, don't ask questions that make people look at the old building too closely. It's bad luck." Ethan realized he would get no corporate truth from her. The hotel management had clearly imposed a gag order on its bloody past. He needed someone who wanted to talk about it. "Who maintains the historical records?" Ethan asked, pulling back. "Someone must know the old crime reports, the newspaper clippings, the archives." Maria hesitated, then pointed subtly with her chin toward the dimly lit, derelict lounge Ethan had passed earlier. "Try Silas. He's not official, but he's been here forever. He doesn't look like much, but if a cockroach sneezed in 1952, Silas has a note on it." Ethan thanked her with a nod and headed into the lounge. It was darker than he remembered, the velvet upholstery of the antique chairs absorbing all available light. In the far corner, hunched over a cluttered table beneath a flickering wall sconce, was an elderly man who perfectly fit the description of an archivist of the damned. The man, thin and severely stooped, wore a threadbare suit that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and dust. He was meticulously flipping through a stack of yellowed newspaper clippings, which he kept stored in a moth-eaten briefcase. "Silas?" Ethan asked quietly. Silas didn't look up immediately. His frail hand paused, pointing with a long, bony finger at a headline on a crumbling piece of paper. 1962, Pauline. Jumped from the window. Just missed the power lines. They cleaned the sidewalk with a hose. He sighed, finally looking up. His eyes, though cloudy with age, were unnervingly sharp. "You're the detective," Silas stated, not as a question, but a certainty. The one they put in 1109. That's a cruel joke, even for the Obsidian. It's the room I requested, Ethan corrected, pulling up an armchair opposite him. I need to know what happened there. Not the easy history, the forgotten one. The chemical stains on the floor. Silas leaned back, folding his hands over his briefcase. The Obsidian doesn't forget, detective. It remembers everything, and it plays favorites. The water tank girl, Elisa Lamb? She was recent. A tourist. She stumbled into something that's been here since the 1940s. He paused, then tapped a finger on the table. Room 1109. The chemical stains. That was the silk case. 1968. Ethan felt a surge of adrenaline. I haven't seen that in any official records. Of course not, Silas scoffed. It was messy. The victim was a dancer named Evelyn Silk. She was loud, demanding, and she knew too much about the wrong people on Main Street. Her killer didn't want her found. He wanted her erased. Silas opened his briefcase, retrieving a heavily creased photograph. It showed a young woman with a defiant, beautiful smile. They didn't find the body, detective, Silas explained, his voice hushed. Just the residue. The killer used a powerful, industrial acid, poured it right into the floorboards, hoping it would seep away through the cracks. It dissolved everything, including the poor woman, leaving behind only the silhouette of where she lay and the chemical scar you saw. Ethan's mind raced, connecting the dots. The torso-shaped stain on his floor. The corrosive nature of the event. But why the dampness now? Ethan asked. Why the water stain on the ceiling? Acid and water don't connect. Silas leaned close, his breath smelling musty and cold. They do here. The Obsidian has a spirit, detective. A cruel intelligence. It absorbs the trauma of its victims, but it also absorbs the method. Evelyn Silk died by dissolution. The hotel uses that corrosive energy. And Elisa Lamb? She died by drowning. The hotel uses the water. Silas pointed toward Ethan's hand, which was clutching the small bag containing the dark hair from the window. They're linked. The victims don't leave, they become part of the hotel's mechanism. But the hotel is waking up now because of you. Why me? You're looking for the ghost that connects the serial killers, the suicides, the acid baths, and the water tank. And the hotel has heard your questions. Be careful, detective. The silk case was about erasure. And the Obsidian often repeats its best work. Absolutely. Ethan returns to the chilling confines of 1109, armed with the horrifying knowledge of the room's history and the crucial warning from Silas. The Obsidian's vast lobby, usually a hive of silent, transient misery, seemed almost welcoming after his conversation with Silas. Ethan needed to process the information. Room 1109, the site of Evelyn Silk's chemical erasure in 1968. The silhouette of a dissolved body etched into the hardwood beneath his carpet. And the terrifying implication that the hotel's malicious intelligence was now focused on him, a detective probing its scars. He returned to the 11th floor. The corridor was now utterly dry. The mottled drag marks that had led away from the elevator in Chapter 2 were completely gone, wiped clean by some unseen force. The air, though still cold, was lighter. The oppressive mildew and metallic scent he had noticed earlier, the fading scent, was dissipating, as if the hotel was actively scrubbing itself clean. Erasure. Just like the silk case. Ethan entered 1109 and bolted the door. He knelt down immediately, pulling back the carpet corner to view the corrosive stain. The dark shape was still there, but where before it had seemed damp, it now looked brittle, dry, and oddly shiny, as if recently treated with a powerful disinfectant. The hotel was trying to cover its tracks. He pulled out the small evidence bag containing the single strand of dark hair he'd found on the window frame, Chapter 3. He examined it under his portable forensic light. It was long, fine, and distinctly not synthetic. If the room was Evelyn Silk's final resting place, the hair could be 50 years old. If it was Elisa Lamb's, it was only a decade old. He sniffed the plastic bag. There was no distinct perfume or shampoo, only the faintest trace of mildew and something else, a clean, chemical scent, like chlorine. He thought of Lamb, found in the water tank. Chlorine is used to treat water. He thought of silk, dissolved by acid. Acid creates chemical burns. The hair, the only physical trace that defied the hotel's efforts at erasure, smelled of both. It was a bridge between the two horrors. Ethan focused on the source of the persistent dampness, which, though fading, was still strongest near the ceiling stain. He moved the bed and climbed onto the mattress, shining his powerful tactical light upward. The circular black stain was directly above the torso silhouette on the floor. He pressed against the plaster. It felt rigid and unusually thick in that spot, suggesting patching. He ran his hands along the wall near the stain. His fingers immediately snagged on a barely perceptible seam in the wallpaper. It was a small, square panel, painted over countless times, but imperfectly sealed. It looked like an old access panel or a small vent leading into the wall cavity. He located the seam again and applied pressure with a flat, thin tool from his kit. The plaster around the panel cracked with a dry, dusty crunch. He pulled the small panel away, revealing a dark, tight cavity filled with ancient wiring, dust, and thick, black residue that looked eerily similar to the stain on the ceiling. He directed his light into the hole. The air that rushed out was cold, stale, and carried a faint, disturbing aroma, a mixture of mildew and something subtly metallic, like old copper or iron. It was the scent of the obsidian's core trauma. He used his phone camera to take a picture deep inside the cavity. The resulting flash image showed the brick wall behind the plaster. In the beam of the light, he saw something unnatural wedged between the electrical conduit and the brick. It was a scrap of fabric, incredibly fine, almost translucent, caught on a rusty pipe. It was the color of faded rose, and when Ethan zoomed in on the picture, he could see the intricate stitching of old, expensive lace. Silas's words echoed in his mind. The silk case. 1968. The victim was a dancer named Evelyn Silk. A scrap of silk lace, caught in the wall of the room where Evelyn Silk was chemically dissolved, defying the killer's, or the hotel's, intent for total erasure. As Ethan reached his hand into the tight space to retrieve the lace, a new sound filtered down the dark, confined space of the vent. It wasn't the melodic murmur of the ghost choir, nor the thumping from the shaft. It was a faint, yet distinct, scratching sound. Rhythmic and frantic, like tiny fingernails desperately clawing at plaster and wood. The sound was coming from directly above him, in room 1209. Ethan froze, the lace scrap untouched. He knew the hotel's history was riddled with inexplicable terror. He knew the voices and the chemical decay were real. But this sound, this was a physical, current disturbance. It sounded like someone was trapped, desperate, and actively trying to claw their way out of the room above. The frantic scratching from room 1209 above was a sound of pure, unadulterated desperation. Ethan Blackwood carefully slid the small scrap of rose-colored silk lace, Chapter 5, into his evidence kit, his mind now operating in full detective mode, the paranormal aspects momentarily receding before the sound of immediate physical distress. He grabbed the stairs, preferring the relative stability of the fire escape to the obsidian's treacherous elevators. He took the 2 flights rapidly. The stairwell was a study in neglect, cold concrete smelling sharply of dust and stale cigarette smoke, but it was fast. He burst back into the 11th floor corridor, checking the atmosphere. The silence had returned. The scratching had stopped. He didn't hesitate. He needed access to 1209, and for that, he needed Maria. Back in the lobby, Maria was startled by his sudden reappearance. Her nervousness was now bordering on palpable fear. Detective Blackwood? What happened? You were gone for an hour. Room 1209. Ethan said, keeping his voice firm and authoritative. I heard frantic noises, scratching, screaming, like someone was locked in and trying to claw their way out. I need a master key. Now. Maria's face went pale. Sir, I can't do that. That room, it's out of service. It's supposed to be empty. It's been empty for months. Then there is an intruder, or someone is in distress. Ethan countered, resting his hand firmly on the counter, mimicking the stance he'd use in an interrogation room. I am a former LAPD detective. If I have to break down that door and you obstructed the rescue, you will be liable. Is 1209 a risk to your guests, Maria? The threat, laced with his official background, was enough. Maria cracked. Her eyes darted around the empty lobby. Just be discreet, she pleaded, reaching under the counter. She pulled out a generic, unmarked master key card, her hand trembling. It's been empty since the last incident. We don't book above the 11th floor unless we absolutely have to. Just 1209 is a maintenance storage room now. Ethan took the key card. It was warm from her hand, a small beacon of human panic in a sea of supernatural dread. Thank you, Maria. Call the police if you hear anything, but not the hotel management. He took the stairs again, ascending past the 11th floor. The 12th floor was noticeably colder than the 11th, the lighting even dimmer. The air pressure felt different, heavier. A long, central corridor stretched before him, identical to the floor below, but profoundly silent. The atmosphere was almost suffocating, thick with a stillness that suggested every breath he took was an intrusion. He found room 1209 at the far end of the corridor. It was marked by a faded "Do Not Enter" sign clumsily taped to the door. Ethan pressed his ear to the cold wood. Silence. The frantic scratching was gone, leaving only the dull, internal hum of the aging building. He cursed softly. The hotel always seemed to anticipate his movements. He used the master key. The electronic lock failed to respond. He tried again. Nothing. Maria had given him the wrong key, or the hotel was actively locking him out. He backed up, ready to use his shoulder, but then he noticed the old, secondary mechanical lock beside the door handle, a relic from the building's earlier, pre-keycard days. He pulled out a small set of lock picks, a habit he'd never lost, and went to work. The lock was rusty, the pins stiff, but after 20 seconds of focused, quiet work, the tumbler clicked. Ethan pushed the door open slowly, his hand instinctively scanning the wall for a light switch. The room was almost perfectly empty, confirming Maria's claim of maintenance storage. There was no bed, no furniture, only bare, heavily scuffed concrete floor, and walls stripped down to the plaster. The smell, however, was overpowering, a concentrated mix of mildew and decaying sulfur. He did a quick scan. Nothing alive. Nothing moving. The scratching had been real. He was sure of it. Where could the sound have come from? The window was sealed shut. The ceiling was intact. He walked into the bathroom. It was also stripped bare, only the sink and toilet remaining. He turned on the faucet. The water that dribbled out was thick, rusty brown, and foul-smelling. He looked into the porcelain toilet bowl. The water was dark, almost black, and unnaturally stagnant. And resting at the bottom of the black water, glinting faintly, was an object that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was a small, black, waterproof digital camera, the kind tourists use. He reached into the dark water, pulling out the camera. It was cold, slimy, and surprisingly heavy. He wiped the screen on his sleeve. The on button was still dimly lit, the battery clinging stubbornly to life. He pressed play. The screen flickered, showing a date, February 2013. The timestamp was approximately 2 a.m. The video was shaky, shot from a low angle. It was pitch black, but then a bright, terrifying flash of light illuminated the surroundings. The Obsidian Hotel's rooftop water tank. The final image on the screen was a distorted, underwater shot of a dark shape sinking into the depths of the tank. Just before the video cut to black, a brief, muffled sound registered. A panicked, choked gasp that sounded exactly like the thump he had heard in the elevator shaft earlier. Ethan was holding the missing camera of Elisa Lamb, the tourist who had vanished on the 11th floor and been found weeks later in the water tank. And someone, or something, had deliberately placed it in the empty room right above the site of the acid bath murder, directly above his head. Absolutely. Ethan Blackwood races against time and the pervasive malevolence of the hotel to retrieve the secrets locked inside Elisa Lamb's camera. Ethan retreated from room 1209, the cold, slimy camera clutched in his hand, his heart pounding a desperate rhythm against the oppressive silence of the 12th floor. He took the stairs back down, feeling the heavy air of the obsidian pressing in on him, urging him to drop the evidence, to forget what he had seen. Back in the dubious safety of room 1109, he locked the door and pulled out his entire detective kit. The camera was the key, the physical, undeniable bridge between the decades of ghostly whispers and the hard reality of Elisa Lamb's death. He set up a makeshift forensic station on the small desk. The camera needed to be dried and secured immediately. He carefully disassembled the casing, the damp, metallic smell of the water mixing with the faint chlorine scent. Using desiccant packs he carried for protecting electronics in humid climates, he began the slow, tedious process of preservation. As he worked, the oppressive atmosphere of 1109 intensified. The faint scent of sulfur, the corrosive residue from Evelyn Silk's dissolution, Chapter 4, returned, stinging his nostrils. The air grew suddenly cold, so cold that Ethan could see his own breath. He knew this wasn't mere air conditioning. The hotel was resisting. "You don't want me to see this," Ethan muttered, his voice hoarse. Too late. After 30 agonizing minutes, he carefully extracted the tiny, damp memory card. He cleaned it meticulously with medical alcohol wipes and inserted it into a ruggedized card reader connected to his encrypted laptop. The screen flickered, displaying the folder structure. The card had survived. There were several dozen video files. He double-clicked the first one marked IMG_0041. The video loaded instantly, but it wasn't the expected rooftop footage. It was grainy, dark, and shot from a fixed, low angle. The date stamp indicated 1991. A flicker of movement. A tall, pale man with manic eyes and a neatly combed haircut entered the frame, looking nervously over his shoulder. He was wearing a dark, slightly stained suit. He moved with a disturbing, predatory confidence, despite his nervousness. He was holding something metallic and heavy, a hammer. Jack Unterweger, the Austrian serial killer who had stayed at the Cecil in 1991 during his murder spree. The video was a glitch, a contamination. The hotel's history was bleeding through the physical evidence, overriding Elisa's footage with a spectral recording of another predator. Ethan quickly dragged the video file onto his laptop's drive, securing the contamination. Then he navigated to the latest file, the one timestamp just moments before the camera went into the water tank, Elisa_final. He opened it. The footage was immediately recognizable. The grainy interior of the Obsidian's elevator from the publicly released surveillance tape. But this angle was different. It was closer, wider. Elisa Lam was visible, pressing the buttons frantically, gesturing outside the frame as if arguing with someone unseen. Suddenly, a massive, distorted shadow filled the frame, eclipsing the light. Elisa spun around, her face contorted in sheer, overwhelming terror. She pressed herself against the back wall of the elevator. The camera, held low, spun wildly. The elevator doors began to slowly close. In the final, terrifying moment before the doors met, the camera focused on the outside hallway, capturing a distorted image of the pursuer. A figure of immense height, dressed entirely in black. Not the gaunt, hatted figure Ethan had seen in the reflection, Chapter 2, but a man of enormous bulk. He stood there, silent and massive, blocking the exit. His face was obscured, but his eyes, gleaming like wet coal, were fixed solely on Elisa. The image held for a single, sickening second. Then, the footage jumped. The scene shifted violently to the rooftop. The darkness, the hiss of steam, the massive silhouette of the water tank. The camera was now clearly being carried, moving rapidly toward the tank. The video stopped abruptly. The screen went dark, displaying an error message. File corrupted. A moment of deafening silence followed, broken only by the whirring of the laptop fan. Then, the fan stopped. The laptop screen went completely black. A small plume of smoke curled up from the card reader slot, carrying the distinct, metallic scent of ozone and burning plastic. The hotel had fought back. Ethan snatched the memory card from the smoking reader. He looked up at the ceiling of room 1109, at the black water stain directly above his head. The cold was intense. The pervasive silence was absolute. He knew what he had seen, a physical, terrifying encounter. Elisa was not alone. The gargantuan figure, a specter of overwhelming dread, had stalked her from the elevator to the rooftop. This figure was not a ghost. It was an extension of the hotel's will, the Obsidian's watchman. And now, the Obsidian knew Ethan had the card. Absolutely. The truth, though dangerous, is compelling. Ethan must now move into the territory of the hotel's known predators to understand the power of the watchman. The smell of burning plastic and ozone from his ruined card reader was a sharp, physical reminder that the Obsidian Hotel was fighting back. Ethan Blackwood quickly wrapped the memory card in an anti-static bag and locked it inside his duffel box. He couldn't analyze the corrupted data here. He needed an external specialist, someone who could recover submerged data without alerting the LAPD or, more crucially, the entity that controlled this building. He knew he had to keep moving. The watchman, the colossal, dark figure captured in Elisa Lamb's final seconds, was the key. He needed to understand if this entity merely absorbed the trauma of the hotel's killers, or if it actively recruited them. The logical next step was the floor infamous for housing the purest form of human evil the hotel had ever known, the 14th floor. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, had lived there during his 1985 murder spree, allegedly disposing of his blood-soaked clothes in the hotel's trash chutes and entering unnoticed through the rear fire escape. Ethan opted for the stairs again, his legs already protesting the rapid ascents and descents. The atmosphere grew heavier with every flight. By the time he reached the 14th floor, the cold was profound, biting and aggressive, carrying no scent of decay, but instead, a dry, sterile airlessness, the air of a place where violence had been executed and meticulously cleaned up. The hallway was noticeably different. The lights were unbroken, the carpeting was slightly cleaner, almost unnaturally so. It was the floor the hotel tried hardest to make look normal, concealing its darkest secret beneath a facade of false hospitality. Ethan moved slowly, his tactical light sweeping the doors. He was looking for room 1411, or any room directly linked to Ramirez's tenancy. He located a small, dusty storage room across from 1411. The door was slightly ajar. He slipped inside. The room was empty, save for old cleaning supplies and a massive, cracked mirror leaning against the far wall. The reflection it offered was distorted, stretching his figure unnaturally thin. As he examined the room, a profound chill settled around him, a heavy presence that felt more physical than the usual ghostly whispers. It was a suffocating weight, the feeling of absolute, conscious predation. He ran his gloved hand along the frame of the broken mirror. It was old, predating the 1985 incidents. He found what he was looking for, a series of shallow, almost invisible etchings carved directly into the metal frame, hidden beneath decades of paint and grime. He used his light to illuminate the markings. There were geometric symbols, rough and uneven, clearly carved with a knife or a sharp tool. They were crude, but recognizable, a pentagram, flanked by two inverted crosses, the hallmark of the Night Stalker's alleged occult leanings. But beside the symbols, carved deeper, almost angrily, were four large, distinct initials, RR, Richard Ramirez, and a single, recurring number, 10. 10. What did the number 10 mean? 10 victims? The 10th month? The 10th floor? Ethan searched his memory of the Cecil's notorious history. Suddenly, the cold air solidified. Ethan's skin prickled. He felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. He knew. Instantly, he was not alone. The presence was immense, filling the room, pushing the oxygen out of the air. It was silent, heavy, and intensely focused on him. It was the feeling of standing beside a colossal, dark engine of malice. He spun around, tactical light raised, aiming it at the doorway. The entrance was empty, but in the large, broken mirror reflecting the empty doorway, the distortion was terrifyingly pronounced. The reflection showed the doorway filled, entirely eclipsed, by a towering, utterly featureless shadow, the bulk of the watchman. The shadow was so dense it seemed to absorb the light Ethan was throwing at it, leaving only a gleaming hint of those wet coal eyes. As the shadow lingered, Ethan heard a new, distinct sound, not a whisper or a scratch, but a deep, guttural sigh that seemed to emanate not from a throat, but from the very foundation of the building. The sigh was immediately followed by a single, resonant metallic thump from the floor directly below him. The 13th floor. The floor the hotel had tried to eliminate from existence, often skipped entirely in elevator buttons, the unlucky, unspeakable floor. The thump was an invitation. Kezenlikel. Haikai, Resmi Olarak var Almayan. Ankak Odalin Karanlik Surlarinen D. Rinliklaren Yatin on Yukunka Kata Dogru Illerlier. The deep, resonant thump that emanated from the 13th floor was not just a sound. It was a deliberate summons. The watchman, the monstrous shadow that haunted the Obsidian, had consciously steered Ethan Blackwood away from the Night Stalker's stale etchings and toward the hotel's architectural wound. The 13th floor was the silence, the void, the floor erased by superstition, yet bursting with the hotel's most volatile secrets. Ethan did not waste time trying the elevators. He knew the master key would skip the floor, and the mechanisms were likely locked down by the hotel's malevolent intelligence. He bolted for the stairwell, descending rapidly from the controlled, sterile malice of the 14th floor. He passed the 12th floor with barely a glance, the memory of Elisa Lamb's waterlogged camera still a cold weight in his hand. He counted the flights, the rough concrete steps jarring his feet, the air growing heavier and thicker with each descent. Between the 12th and 14th, there should have been the 13th. The fire escape door that should have led to the 13th floor landing was different. It wasn't the usual white, fireproof metal. This door was black, unpainted, and scarred with deep, horizontal gouges, as if something massive had repeatedly tried to force its way out. It bore no number plaque. Ethan reached the landing and paused. The air was overwhelmingly stagnant, dense with the odor of coal dust, ozone, and a faint, sweet smell of something long dead, like dried, withered flowers. This air was decades old, never cycled, trapped. He pushed the door open carefully. It let out a long, tortured scream of grinding metal hinges. He stepped onto the 13th floor. The difference was immediate and total. This wasn't the dimly lit, stained hallway of the lower floors. This was the hotel's tomb. The light was minimal, supplied only by a single, bare incandescent bulb hanging precariously from the ceiling, casting long, wavering shadows. The walls were not merely peeling. They were stripped down to the original, crumbling plaster. The linoleum had been torn up decades ago, revealing the cold, unfinished concrete floor beneath. Every surface was covered in a uniform layer of fine, black dust. The door numbers were old brass plates, not the modern plastic slips. Ethan could barely make out the numbers through the grime. 1301, 1302. He was looking for 1310, the mysterious number etched by Richard Ramirez. He moved down the corridor, his footsteps loud and echoing in the suffocating silence. He was moving through an architectural wound, a forgotten layer of reality. He found room 1310 at the corner. The brass plate was tarnished and dull. The lock was an obsolete, heavy mechanical tumbler. The door itself was the oldest he had seen, made of heavy, dark oak, reinforced with iron straps, more like a vault door than a hotel room. As he reached out to touch the heavy iron handle, he noticed something on the floor near the door frame. Tucked into a narrow space where the concrete met the wall was a small, desiccated pile of refuse, mostly dust and rusted metal shavings. But nestled within the debris was a stack of old, brittle paper. Ethan carefully extracted the papers. They weren't receipts or hotel forms. They were handwritten, meticulously detailed maintenance logs, dating back to the late 1940s. The paper was fragile, turning to powder at his touch. The logs detailed repair work for specific rooms, but the entries for the 13th floor were unnerving. 1947, room 1310, transfer, 1, urgent. Disposal required. Heavy damage to wood floor. New carpeting needed ASAP. 1952, room 1304, cleaning. Excessive fluid retention in mattress. Use industrial disinfectant. Do not inform management. 1958, room 1307, ceiling. Secure access panel to central air conduit. Complaints of incessant whispering. Transfer, 1. Ethan knew what that meant. In the veiled language of the early Cecil, transfer was code for an unregistered death, a suicide or a murder the hotel staff handled themselves to protect their reputation. He flipped to the last page of the logbook. The paper was thicker here, like a ledger cover, bound in cracked, dark leather. The last entry was brief, written in a bold, almost obsessive hand. 1985, room 1310. RR found the source. Connected. The number 10 was not just a number. It was the specific room on the forgotten floor, room 1310, where Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, had located and documented the hotel's dark, central power source. The watchman hadn't led Ethan here just to find a dead body. He had led him to the Obsidian's operating manual. Ethan felt a crushing wave of despair mixed with profound terror. The hotel was not just haunted by the ghosts of its victims. It was being powered by the traumatic residue of its most sadistic guests. As he stood there, frozen, the single light bulb above his head gave a final, desperate flicker. The light died. plunging the 13th floor into absolute, suffocating darkness. The silence was instantaneously replaced by the crescendo of the whispered choir. The voices were everywhere, frantic and overwhelming, echoing from the walls of the tomb. The source. The source. And then, a new sound, chillingly close, a wet, dragging sound on the rough concrete floor, moving slowly toward room 1310. It was the sound of something immense, something massive and wet, moving in the dark. Absolutely. Trapped in the darkness of the forgotten 13th floor, Ethan Blackwood must now face the physical manifestation of the hotel's evil to understand its heart. The utter blackness of the 13th floor was a heavy, suffocating blanket. The chorus of whispers, frantic and high-pitched, pressed in on Ethan Blackwood from all directions, drowning out the sound of his own desperate breathing. The only thing piercing the chaos was the low, wet, rhythmic drag of the watchman moving down the concrete corridor toward room 1310. Ethan was frozen for only a second, the time it took for his detective training to override the primal terror. He snapped on his tactical flashlight, a blinding, narrow beam that sliced through the gloom. He aimed it not at the source of the dragging, but at the door of room 1310. The beam illuminated the final stretch of the hall. The wet sound was now terrifyingly close, about 30 feet away, accompanied by a sickening squelch as the heavy mass shifted its weight on the dusty concrete. Ethan lunged for the vault-like oak door of 1310. The antique iron handle was ice-cold. He cursed, realizing the mechanical lock was still engaged. He needed to be quick. He dropped his flashlight and grabbed his lock picks, working blind, the whispers screaming a cacophony of names and warnings directly into his ears. He sees you. The water is rising. He could hear the watchman's breathing now, a labored, wet rasp, like air being sucked through soaked wool. He glanced over his shoulder. The flashlight, still on the floor, illuminated a stretch of the hallway, but the watchman was still concealed in the absolute darkness just beyond the beam. Click. The first pin dropped. Squelch. Drag. The watchman was closer. Click. Click. The second and third pins. The lock was stubborn, resisting the intrusion. The chorus of whispers reached a fever pitch, dissolving into a collective, agonizing shriek of pure suffering. The air pressure in the hallway spiked, feeling like a crushing weight against Ethan's chest. With a final, desperate twist, the tumbler gave way. The lock thunked open. Ethan snatched his light, burst through the door, and slammed it shut behind him, fumbling for the thick iron bolt. He secured the vault door just as the massive, wet bulk of the watchman slammed against the exterior, shaking the entire 13th floor with the impact. The heavy oak door held. Ethan leaned against the cold wood, gasping for air, the terrifying roar of the entity muted to a deep, resonant thrum vibrating through the floor and the walls. He raised his tactical light, sweeping the beam across room 1310. It was not a guest room. It was the mechanical nexus of the entire wing. The room was vast, high-ceilinged, and filled with a terrifying, industrial architecture. The walls were lined not with plaster, but with exposed concrete and brick, crisscrossed by a monstrous network of thick, metallic pipes and ventilation ducts, the conduits of chaos. These conduits were not merely utilitarian. They were the arteries and veins of the hotel's malice. A central, vertical shaft dominated the room, encased in rusted iron grating. It was massive, running from the floor and disappearing high into the ceiling. Ethan realized this was the main service conduit, containing the primary water, sewage, and ventilation lines for the entire central spine of the Obsidian. And clinging to every pipe, every joint, every surface, was a thick, dark, gelatinous residue that glistened in the light. It smelled overwhelmingly of decay, iron, and faintly, of bleach and chlorine. He understood instantly what Richard Ramirez had meant by the source. The hotel's intelligence didn't reside in a ghost or a single room. It resided in its massive, interconnected mechanical system. The conduits were the medium. The whispers of the victims, Elisa, Evelyn, the suicides, traveled through the vents. The corrosive residue of the acid baths, Evelyn's silk, was absorbed by the sewage pipes, leaving the chemical scars. The trauma of drowning, Elisa Lamb, was carried by the water lines, causing the inexplicable dampness in the lower rooms. The watchman itself, the massive, wet entity, was a physical manifestation of this concentrated, waterlogged evil, using the conduits to travel. The obsidian was not just haunted. It was a living, parasitic organism that fed on human trauma, using its plumbing and vents as a nervous system. Ethan moved to the central conduit shaft, aiming his light deep into the grating. The pipes were vibrating intensely, resonating with the struggle of the watchman just outside the door. He knelt down, noticing a small, dark object caught in the grating at the base of the shaft. He reached through the cold, viscous residue and pulled it out. It was a small, crudely carved wooden figurine, a doll. Its eyes were painted wide and black, and around its neck was tied a thin, fraying piece of rose-colored silk lace. The silk lace from room 1109, Evelyn Silk's room. The same lace he found tucked into the window frame, now tied to a ritualistic artifact left here years ago. The watchman slammed against the door again, harder this time. The iron bolt groaned. Through the heavy oak, a voice, deep, inhuman, and terrifyingly clear, finally spoke, shattering the wall of whispers. "You have seen the source, detective. Now, become part of the flow." To be continued.